Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Class number 2 of the Vimshartari Dasha class. And we've had interesting conversations over on the forum about 3 different charts. 2 of them I had the opportunity to take a look at 2 of those charts. But the 3rd chart, the one dealing with birth of a younger sibling, didn't get a chance to look at that yet. I had a little confusion because I thought someone had sent me a chart, looked different than that. But anyway, we'll get to that next week. So I have 2 charts today that we're going to look at. And one of the main things we're going to focus on primarily are going to be the influence of transits and dashas. But before we get into that, I just want to go over some basic information, which I know we probably touched on last time, but I want to go over it again because these are things that you really have to get involved, particularly if you're going to be working with dashas and working on predictions or working out the trends of a person's life. So first of all, one thing I want to stress is that it's a wonderful idea, as you know, to study the specifics of astrology, whether you're learning Brihat Parashar Horashastra or Janvi, whether you're getting into the mathematical aspects of a chart. But you have to remember that astrology is as much an art as it is a science. And the same principles that are applied to art, such as making music or writing or poetry or the beautiful things that we have in the world, also apply to astrology in the sense that in order to create something amazing, create something beautiful, something moving, whether it's with music or sculpture or writing, you do have to know how to use the tools of your trade. Meaning you have to know how to use the instrument, the musical instrument. You have to know the scales of the musical instrument. If you're writing, you have to know punctuation. You have to have a good vocabulary. You have to know how to create dialogue. These are all things that you have to have in order to do something well within that particular art. And so there's a science to the art, other arts also. Now with Vedic astrology, we have the same situation. We have to understand what the planetary dignity is. We have to understand how to read a chart, how to look at a chart. We have to understand what are the possibilities that can be indicated based on Saturn getting starved by the moon or Jupiter delighting Mercury. We have to know what the possibilities of these things are. So we have to have them within our mind and within our consciousness, which is why studying astrology takes a long time. Because there's a lot to learn, there's a lot of techniques, there's a lot of different tools. But when it comes right down to it, and you might have experienced this as well, when it comes right down to it, to doing a chart, we did do the step-by-step astrology class, where those of you who participated know that we had 14 or 15 steps and 13 sub-steps in each one of those. And that was a very logical, linear method of getting the static promise of a chart. And once you know the static promise of a chart, then of course you can apply that to the dashas. And there is this emphasis towards astrology, which I'm completely for, of making it more scientific. Ernst Wilhelm is very big on that. Anyone who's serious about astrology really wants to make this a scientific endeavor. But what we have to remember, again, is that there's an art and a science. And you might have found that whenever you try to read a chart, yes, you want to have some framework to go on when you're looking at the chart. You want to know, okay, I need to start here, I need to go to point A, to point B, to point C. You need to do that. But what you might find is when it comes to predictions, or when it comes to answering questions for an individual, it doesn't always work. And you can find this as well when it comes to homework that you've done. Like, for example, if you're doing like a, how do I describe it? If you're doing an exercise in astrology, and so a teacher or someone says, here's a chart, tell me what this person was going through in the Saturn, Sun, Mars dasha. And you look at that Saturn, Sun, Mars dasha, and you're so overwhelmed by what could possibly be going on, because not only do you have this birth chart to look at, but you also have all 16 Vargas. You have transits. Transits are always moving. You have all these different layers of things that you can look at. And so more often than not, it's usual that when it comes to looking at a particular chart, and it's not actually a client, or you're not actually doing a reading, you're more likely to make mistakes. Now, why is that the case? Because when someone hires you or engages your services as an astrologer, or a friend comes to you and asks you a question, there's a connection made. And it's beyond that part of our brain that uses the logical aspects of things. We have to use both sides of the brain, the right and left side, just again, as with art. And so when someone comes to you and asks you a question, and you have to look at that chart, something happens whereby if you are clear and calm and you're able to pay attention, you are guided in the right direction, what to look at within the chart. And you have to be able to do that. And try to think of it again like music or writing. When you're a musician, if you are playing in a band and it's time to improvise or it's time to create something powerful musically, if you are a musician and you've tried to do it, you know that if you sit down and you try to force yourself, you say, okay, I know I need to use the D mixolydian scale, and I need to use these certain chords, and maybe I'll use a gap note scale. You have all this information within your mind, and I'm going to write an amazing piece of work. Well, anyone who tries to do that is going to usually fail miserably at actually creating something worthwhile. But what happens is, if you have that information within your mind, and I found this to be true because I also play music and I also write, I know how to write and I also know how to play music, that it's when I just simply sit there and wait, knowing that I have all the knowledge in my fingers, I have all the knowledge in my mind, I know how to write dialogue, I know what scales to use in certain keys. If I wait and I just start fiddling around, I just start playing around. Even when it comes to writing, one thing you can do is just start writing. It doesn't matter if you're writing anything worthwhile at all. You just start writing whatever comes out. Eventually, you kind of lock into a groove. Some other part of your being, your consciousness, your brain engages. And so you're able to use the logical aspect, which knows what needs to be done, and you're able to fill it out with the nonlinear aspect or the artistic aspect. And life is built of both of these things, so we can't just have one. So the more that you are beating your head into a wall, trying to figure out how can I logically make this work every single time for every single client, no matter what chart I'm looking at, what logical step-by-step fashion can I force my work into to make this happen, you're going to be more frustrated and you're not going to be able to do a good job. So what I want to recommend is that when it comes to looking at a chart, study your material another time. Meaning, like, for example, in the morning when I wake up after meditation, I get out Brihat Parashar Horashastra, or I get out one of the manuals that I have from Ernst Wilhelm. Sometimes I even get out my own books just to review. And I study for about 15 to 20 minutes. I pay attention to what are some important principles that I want to get in my head and just hold on to. And it's best, again, as I mentioned, if you don't use your own chart. Why? Because if you're using your own chart, or if you're using the chart of someone that you're really heavily invested in, you're going to be looking at ways to get around certain things, ways to get around certain rules that you know. Surely that can't be right. Surely this is right. So you're not thinking clearly. You're invested. You're attached. But if you do it at a different time, and you're not looking at charts, and you're just trying to get it in your head, then when you are looking at charts later on in the day, you'll look at the chart and you'll sit down and you'll stare at it. And this is something that I found to be most effective. I do use the step-by-step procedures to get my mind going, which means if someone asks me about sixth house matters of health, well, I go to the sixth house, and then I just start considering those step-by-step procedures that I have there. Looking at the sixth house Lord, planets in the sixth house, Lajataya Vashta is on the sixth house, go to the D30. I do all this stuff just to get things going. Once I do that, I let it go. And I'll sit there and I'll just stare at the screen. I'll just stare at it, not thinking, not trying to analyze anything, wondering, okay, what do I need to know here? What's the deal? And all of a sudden I'll become aware of a certain planetary position or a certain Lajatadiya Vashta, or I'll think to myself, well, maybe I should go check the transits in regards to Ashtaka Varga. See, for example, in Kala, if you go to, let's pick one randomly here. If you pick a screen and you go to, there we are, Sarvashtaka Varga. Well, this is one thing we'll get into a little bit later on, not too in detail just because it's complicated. So as long as you know how to use this Sarvashtika Varga, that's all you need to know. We don't need to go into the specifics of it. But if you want to, you can look at Brihat Parashara Shastra, and that'll really spin your mind around a little bit. But I might be sitting there thinking, okay, well, I know there's a planet transiting the sixth house, and I see that through Sarvashtika Varga, there's pretty good points, 39 points, that's pretty good. So I have the sense that the transit is probably going to be better than worse, even if it's a malefic planet. Right? Now, this is one way that you start getting into the combination of the left and right brain function. You will only really be able to do, at least in my estimation, a good reading or a good chart analysis if you have the tools, the information in your mind already, and then you also have the capacity to not stress out, to be interested in the chart, curious about it. Okay, what's this all about? And then allow the non-linear aspect of you to draw you into the areas that you want to assess. And again, always remember, I always compare it to music or writing. If you try to force it, you're going to get confused, frustrated, anxious, and you're not going to do a very good job. But if you're able to be patient and sit there and wait, things will start popping into your mind. You'll start being drawn to different areas, and you'll start remembering the techniques that you need for this particular chart. And this is very important. This will save you a lot of frustration, and I think you'll find that it actually works out much better. And you'll see why this is the case, why this is so important. Because, first of all, there's so much in the chart. I even wonder how we can do any kind of trends or any kind of predictions at all, just because there are so many possibilities. And I wonder that most often when I'm trying to be too logical about it. But the best work always comes out when I use the techniques that I have, and then I let the chart reveal itself. That's how I like to look at it. And those are always the best sessions. Those are always the ones where people write back or they call back and they say, wow, whatever you were talking about during that particular time, it actually came to pass. And I was surprised. And I was too, because if I went through all these logical steps, I could contradict myself and I could see all these multiple contradictions in the chart. But you have to learn to trust. You have to learn to trust the process. And that's not just with astrology. That's with your spiritual practice. That's with anything you're trying to learn. I was recently reading a book called Tripura Rahasya, which is a wonderful book. It's better if you already have regular meditation practice for a good number of years before you read it. And that's not because I'm trying to be one of those individuals who said to me many years ago, well, that's only for an advanced yogi. It's because you need to have some grounding in the capacity to contemplate things. But anyway, in this book, it goes on to talk about that the reason a yogi can materialize his thoughts, or the reason a yogi can materialize or change one's karma, is because they're not scattered. They're not indecisive in their directions, their actions, and their thoughts. And so what we find is within the birth chart that this is a reflection of all the thoughts, actions, and tendencies that you have, or anyone has. And some charts really point very strongly in one particular direction, and they're going to have easy success in that direction. And they have success in that direction. And the reason a person can't materialize something is because they're scattered. They're doing one thing, thinking about something else. They're not trusting themselves. And I wish I had the book. I think it's by my bed. But one of the quotes within this book, someone asked the sage, well, how come you can materialize your thoughts and I can't? And the sage said, well, it's because your thoughts, your intentions, your actions are all scattered. And the ones that you do want to make happen, you don't trust. Like you don't believe that it's even possible in your mind, somewhere in your conscious, so it doesn't work. So we have to get all these things lined up, and it's the same thing for astrology. So yes, this is one of the reasons why I want to encourage you in this fashion, because it's really easy to get frustrated and to get so hung up on the details that you never get anywhere. And that's been something that's the only most difficult thing that I've seen, like where people consider mutual agenda. Because if we look at mutual agenda within the dashas, we need to consider, okay, what does Jupiter rule? All right, what house is he in? What are all the multitudes of things that Jupiter could possibly rule? And you end up, by the time you get done with all the dasha sequences, any planet can mean anything, and somehow you're supposed to make sense of that. So that always just drove me nuts. But then you get back to this idea of trust. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. Now, we're going to be talking about transits today. And this is very important because not only do the transits trigger aspects within the chart, but they also lead us to consider what do we need to be paying attention to during a particular dasha cycle, right? Because it's one thing to say someone's in a Saturn dasha, or a Saturn Mars dasha, or a Saturn Rahu dasha. And yes, we can look and see, well, Saturn's in the ninth house. Could deal with the father, difficulties with the father, also fortunes. And we can get a general idea of what the dasha is going to bring in that way. But to narrow it down and make it more specific, we need to see, well, what is Saturn doing by transit? And you'll see this as we go through the two charts that we have today. Also, we need to remember that when it comes to transits, a transit cannot give an effect unless it's already indicated within the person's birth chart. And you'll see this happen over and over, and I did talk about this briefly in one of my other videos, that that love transits happen all the time. Venus is going to go through your seventh house, usually at least once a year. But do you fall in love once a year? Do you meet someone once a year? No. So what we have to see is that if the person has a chart that has a stellar seventh house, which means they're good at connecting with people, they're good at making new partnerships, new relationships, if that's already there and it's strong, well, every time Venus triggers that area of the chart by transit, they're probably going to meet someone. Why? Because it's already in the chart. You know people like that. You know people who have no problem whatsoever meeting someone, and you know people who don't ever meet anyone except for once every 30 years. And why might they not meet someone once every 30 years? Well, maybe their seventh lord is Saturn, and maybe there's an indication towards delays and separation within the relationship. So not only is Saturn now in charge of bringing people together, and he moves slowly through the zodiac, which means maybe once every 30 years he's going to give the opportunity, but everyone's different in this regard. So you always have to remember, you have to look at the birth chart first to see, is it even possible? Okay. And the other thing, too, on the flip side of that, there are negative things that happen by transit. Saturn and Mars, Saturn and the Sun, these are all things that when they come together by transit, they can give some sort of separation or heartbreak or destruction. But if the chart has a strong 10th house and a strong first house, which means the person's activity is powerful within the world and that they are a powerful individual, this is an individual that you can say things like, yes, this will be a difficult time period, but is it actually going to destroy them? Probably not, because the innate foundation is strong. So think of it, kind of like a castle. If the castle is strong and a bad transit comes along, that's like a marauding army, well, the castle can fend off that difficulty. If a person has a weak first house or a weak 10th house, then every time a negative transit occurs, something goes to hell. And you'll see that over and over again within people's charts. So always remember, you have to look at the birth chart first to see what is the potential of that chart. Once you know the potential, you can compare it to dashas, and you can use transits to get a sense of when is something going to happen. All right, so we're going to put all this into play here in just a moment. Now we're also going to look at Vargas, because these are very important. The Vargas are going to show us the ups and the downs within a particular dasha. But we have to remember that the birth chart, so right here, the main birth chart, the B1, that is the natural path of an individual. You can have a great path, but you can have a difficult Varga. So you might have a wonderful seventh house where you meet people. You're always connecting to them in the Rashi chart, so in the D1. But maybe you look at the D7 or the D9, and let's say the D7 is great. So you can get together with people, be intimate, be creative. But anytime it comes to commitment, the D9 has all kinds of difficulties with it. So it never actually makes it to committed marriage and relationships. This is how we start to see, will this person be able to get into a relationship? you might see that the path for marriage or relationship in the D1 just looks terrible from the birth chart. But you go and you look at the D9, or the Navamsha for committed relationships, and you see that Jupiter is in a wonderful place, Venus is in a wonderful place, the ascendant within the D9 is well supported. That means that this person's going to have difficulty finding someone, but when they do, and they're able to commit, it's going to be solid, it's going to be good. So we have all these things we have to consider, and with the D10 as well. You might see someone who has a wonderful chart for career, being successful, powerful in the world, from the birth chart. It's supported from the birth chart. Yet you look at the D10, and Saturn's in a bad placement, or Sun's in the 8th house. And so outwardly, they are outwardly successful. But inwardly, there's a lot of changes, a lot of frustration, a lot of drama. They don't really get the same fulfillment out of it that they should based on the birth chart. So remember that the birth chart itself will show the general path. When we want to zoom in, the Dasamsha for the career or any of these Vargas, they'll show us what is the inner fruit or the inner result, the inner feeling of that particular experience. And you know plenty of people who are wealthy. It's indicated in their birth chart. They're not happy with their wealth, indicated in the Hora or in the Chaturtamsha. Or you know plenty of people who are poor and don't have hardly anything, yet their Hora and their Chaturtamsha is wonderful. So they appreciate everything that they have. They don't complain. You know, there's this interplay. And this is one of the things we have to remember, is that the Vimshatari dasha system is a nakshatra-based dasha, which is based on the moon. And the moon represents our jiva, our ego, and it represents more our emotional feeling nature to things. So a lot of these things are more of a reflection of our inner state, which is obviously that reflection of the outer state. So whatever we feel internally is going to be reflected externally, which is how these dashas work. Now, and I bring up the dasha thing because that's how we can see contradictions between the Dasamsha and the D1 or any Varga in the D1. If there's a contradiction, it doesn't necessarily mean there is an obvious contradiction. It means that there might be a contradiction in regards to what the person actually physically experiences versus their internal experience of it. So that's really where the contradiction comes into play. And you see that all the time. People with their outward experiences contradicted by their inner experiences. Okay, so quick question. If Vimsotari Dasha is based on the moon, how important is birth time? It's very important, especially if you're going to be working down to 5 levels. You know, these things change very quickly. Like, for example, just in this chart, April 3rd, 1976, we see we go from a Saturn, Mars, Moon, Venus, Moon period to a Saturn, Mars, Moon, Venus, Mars period. Well, in this chart, Moon is in the 4th house, Mars is in the 11th house. Totally different energy. So what we see is that if we're going to go down to the 5th level, we do have to have a very accurate birth time. I very, very rarely go down to the 5th level for this very reason. I usually stick to the first 3 levels. Sometimes I'll go down to the 4th. And then I use dashas, I use transits in order to flesh it out. Now, when I'm doing a rectification, which can take a long time, then I'll usually go down to the 5th level because I have a lot of time. I can actually spend 2 hours debating whether Mars, Rahu, what it's going to give, and then I can tweak it, you know, using the 5th level. But it's very rare that I go down to this level. So yes, the birth time is more important. The finer sub-period that you go into. Okay, let's see. All right, now I want to give you a little clue, aside from transits, in regards to how to figure out what to look at for an experience in life. And this goes to how you assess the chart, first of all, before you do anything else, before you even look at the dasha. So what most people do, and what I find most astrologers want to do, is they want to analyze every dasha. They want to analyze, you know, Saturn, Mercury, Ketu, Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars, and then they want to take it down to the 2nd level and the 3rd level. They want to do that because they want to make sure that they're predicting something specifically. And what they find is that every time they try to analyze a specific dasha, well, then they realize, oh no, well, now I have to do this for for these 16 charts, basically. And can you imagine how much time that would take if you were trying to analyze every dasha for every specific area of life? So what I recommend doing is, first of all, analyze the birth chart. Start there. And let's just, I'm going to go into this when we actually start looking at this chart, but like the specifics. So we have Saturn and Sun in the ninth house within this particular chart. We know Saturn represents something, we know Sun represents something. We know when these two planets get together, by Lajtati Vasha, they mean something. We know that when it happens in the ninth house, it means something. And it's all going to add up to a particular experience. So this combination of Saturn and Sun, it's going to give the foundation of the difficulties indicated by Saturn and Sun in regards to ninth house things throughout this person's life. But it's going to actually manifest in a specific event when either the Saturn dasha gets activated and the Sun dasha gets activated. So Saturn, Sun, Sun, Saturn. When those two dashas get activated, this indication, that's when it's going to occur. So this is why I say, instead of thinking that you need to analyze every particular dasha, every particular combination, what you need to do is analyze the chart first and figure out, what does the moon mean in Pisces? What does it mean? Let's see here. Turn the screens up. What does it mean that the moon is getting aspected by the sun to 55 points, which is strong? Now, this is out of 60. See that Mercury? Yeah, Mercury to 60 points, Saturn to 55 points. These are the strongest aspects. So these influences are going to have a specific effect on that moon. What does that mean? And if I can read the chart and know that, then I know when they get to Moon-Sun dasha, or when they get to Moon-Mercury dasha, or Moon-Saturn dasha, with those specific indications, that's when they're going to happen. So you don't have to go through all the chart and say, well, when is this person going to get in a relationship? Well, the way that you do that is you go and you find the 7th house lord, you find the first house lord in the Saptamsha, 7th house lord in the Saptamsha, and you figure out, when are these things getting activated, when are they coming together? And then you can say, oh, all right, well, let's see, Mercury. Well, I'm probably going to look more towards the Mercury dasha, which occurs in 1981 for this person and runs through 1998. So it's going to be somewhere in that particular period of time. All right. And then we can look at maybe Mercury Jupiter, or Mercury Moon, or Mercury Venus, depending on if this is a male or a female. We can focus on Mercury Venus, Mercury Moon, Mercury Jupiter to see, are these going to give something in regards to relationships? And that's how you start narrowing it down. So you don't want to beat your brains out analyzing every single dasha. What you want to do is figure out, what do the planetary placements mean, and then figure out when do those dashas get activated, and that's when you bring it up. Okay. Now, of course, the difficult factor is that you meet someone who doesn't have a good relationship chart, and so they're going to drive the point home, well, when am I going to meet someone? Surely it's soon. This happens all the time. And one client I know, she got into relocational astrology, which I'm not that big of a fan of, because it's, in my mind, that your chart follows you. So you're bringing your karma with you wherever you go. And she was a client for a long time, very long time, and she got into relocational astrology. And she talked to another astrologer who said, oh, well, if you move to this area, you'll probably meet someone. And she's been in a dry spell for 16 years. And it's indicating in her chart, because the time period she's in is more of a career time period than a relationship time period. And she asked me about it, and I said, I don't think it's going to work, but, do what you need to do. And sure enough, when the person moved, they wrote me a letter. They just met someone wonderful. I still didn't think it was going to go anywhere, so I said, well, that's great. But in my mind, then I knew her chart. 2 weeks later, she made this big move. The relationship didn't work out. Still having relationship difficulties. So that's the hard part about it, is that someone might ask you a question, and you can't give them a good answer. not that you can't give them a good answer, like a correct answer, but you can't give them a good answer in the sense that, the dasha just doesn't say you're going to get in a relationship that's going to be functional or it's going to last. So that's the hard part about astrology. But again, that's where remedial measures or meditation or rising above our kind of comes into play, which is not the focus of this class. Now, one other thing I do want to say about dashas that I want to just throw this out there for you to keep in mind. This is not something I've read in the book. This is just something that over the years I have noticed, and so it's a more theoretical idea. And that is, let's just take relationships since we're on that topic. If someone is in a time period that it looks bad for relationships, yet they are in a relationship, usually that means that there's some issues, difficulties with that relationship. And then let's say they're getting ready to switch dashas, and they're getting ready to go into a period of a good relationship, again, indicated by the dashas. And you make that prediction, or maybe you say that the relationship's going to get better. But what happens is the relationship doesn't get better, it ends. Your prediction was totally wrong, but it wasn't because you just weren't reading it right. What I have found almost always happens is that when someone's in a difficult relationship and they're in a bad dasha, and they're coming into a good relationship period, the bad relationship ends. Why? Because if your karma is saying you're going to be in a good relationship, you can no longer sustain a bad relationship. So of course the relationship ends, but the problem is that most people are so invested in that relationship that they've just spent 10 years in, 16 years in, 20 years in, they think it's bad that relationship ended. So we always have to remember that our understanding of life and how we attach to things and what we identify with is helpful. Even in the Yoga Sutras, there's a number of yogic texts that say it's easy for a person to think that poison is nectar and that nectar is poison, and that happens within our charts. So don't always be upset if you're looking at someone's chart and you're getting ready to predict a wonderful time period, whether it's for career or whether it's for relationships, and then all of a sudden whatever they're doing terminates. You might want to say, if you're in a bad situation, this might terminate and you might go into a good situation. Now, if they're attached to it, you can't help that. But we always have to remember that moving from dasha to dasha, if we're in a supportive time period, it cannot usually support the bad things that we've been doing, which is why we have these significant shifts, which can seem painful if you're attached to certain things. Or if you're going into a bad period from a good period, that can also give loss or a change. And then you're a little more accurate in regards to it's going to be a bad thing. Because, yes, then it actually does become a bad thing. It's not just the transition that's bad, it's the rest of it as well. So we need to keep this in mind. So consider that when you are looking at charts. Okay, I want to just double check and see if I want to get right into this chart or go over a few more notes. I think we'll just go into the chart. Okay, yes, let's do that. Okay, so first of all, and remember as we're going, that if you have questions, type them in the little chat box. And just to check real quick, Jennifer, can you hear me now? I know you said you were going to log off and log back in. I want to make sure that the volume's working for you.